What's up, YouTube? I'm going to show you how I turn this into this. Let's get started. All right, let's start this Bat Cave Keezer bar build. I started off by putting a piece of OSB on top and measuring it out to figure out the size that I wanted for the bar top. I cut that to size, made sure there was a little bit of an overhang so that it would fit around the box that I'm creating. Now I pop off the hinges. I'm removing these hinges because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a collar to make this taller so that it will fit my kegs and my CO2 tank inside. Then I'm just going to reattach those spring-loaded hinges to the collar that I create. And I'm using 2x8s and 2x4s to create the collar. I needed that an offset in order to create enough space that I could fit all of my kegs inside and the bar height that I wanted, and make sure that the one keg that was sitting on the shelf would fit. I created pocket screws for all these, and then I doubled up and glued them as well. Probably overkill, but I wanted to make sure that this was rock solid. This Kreg jig I'm using here is fantastic. Makes it really easy to do pocket screws. I like pocket screws because not only do they pull the boards directly together the way I want them, but they're hidden well. For a setup like this, it keeps the inside of those walls smooth. Again, gluing and screwing on these. Just want to make sure that the top of this is really rock solid. I put the lid on just to confirm the measurements and make sure that the lid on the freezer door is sealing. Now, to seal the top of the freezer to the collar itself, I used caulk. I also put pocket screws on the inside of the collar so I could screw it directly down into the freezer to secure it in place. Probably overkill, but I also used caulk on all the seams on the inside of the collar. Not taking any chances. I put this weight on top to make sure that there was pressure on the back seal and it was compressed when I attached the hinges. I'm not so much worried about the size in the front because they'll have the weight of the rest of the bar top on it to push down on that seal. Now for the fun part. I'm making the actual box that the freezer slides into the back of. This is the bulk build of the Keezer bar. The simplicity of the design technique that I went with is fantastic. All I'm doing is making a giant box that I can slide the freezer into the back of. The Keezer bar top sits on top of the door on the collar that I built. So this is just a simple frame that I'm going to decorate, trim out, and make it look the way I want it to look. The advantage of this is that it's super easy to do. You're just making the frame and decorating it, and then you slide the freezer into the back. Because it's not load bearing, I was able to use light, thin plywood for this. The whole thing ended up actually being heavier than I expected, but I worked that out later with some sliders. Since originally I had this sitting on carpet, I just used a bunch of carpet sliders glued to the bottom. Even though this is thin plywood, I went ahead and screwed all these in to give it rigidity. This part isn't bearing any weight, but I still want it to feel solid when I'm done. This is the brains of the operation. That is the Inkbird temperature controller. What this does is checks the temperature inside the freezer and cycles the freezer compressor on and off. You don't want this thing actually freezing your beer. You want to set a temperature that's above freezing, and this is the unit that actually maintains the temperature inside there to keep your beer at drinking temperature instead of at freezer temperature. So what I did was I cut out a hole in the plywood, and then I had to make a bracket to offset it because it was too deep to actually sit inside the unit itself on the plywood without some sort of support. It actually ended up being about an inch thick that I needed it to sit through because that unit is fairly deep and I didn't want to take up a whole bunch of space inside of the Keezer bar just for that controller. I decided to do a coffin top style on the top of my Keezer bar. So I started working on the coffin top. This went through a couple of changes and modifications as I designed it because I wasn't 100% sure on exactly how I wanted to look. I just did a couple sketches and started putting some pieces together and seeing how they actually looked on top. But I knew that I wanted this to have a coffin top. One, to get it higher and make it look more like a bar where you would pour a beer, and two, to keep it high enough that my kids couldn't mess with the taps. Time for some sanding. I realized that while I worked on the coffin top, I could go ahead and get some paint going on this body, so we started to sand. While I was sanding it, these screws started to catch, so I sunk those in a little bit deeper so they would stop ripping up my sandpaper. While I get this ready for prep and paint, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like and subscribe. I am still trying to figure out what I want to do for the design on the front of this thing, but I know that the backdrop's going to be black, so I went ahead and started rolling out the first couple coats of black paint on this to get the base done. When you're flying by the seat of your pants, sometimes you end up redoing things and realizing there's a better way, which is exactly what happened to me on this trim. After laying out that first one, I realized that the edges weren't perfect. I wasn't getting my good 45s and it didn't line up with how I wanted it on the box. After that, I redid the frame on both sides on the actual case so that I could measure and cut each piece and get it positioned exactly the way I wanted it instead of trying to make the frame on the ground and then place it on the box. I still glued everything to the frame to make sure that it was solid, but I realized I didn't actually need to screw the pieces into each other. I just needed them attached to the box itself. This was how I went about doing the rest of the trim for the three sides that face out. Didn't really do anything about the back side because it goes against the wall, so that's just bare freezer. One change I also made, as you'll see, I realized I wanted that trimmed overlay so that not only did it flow together on the corners better, but then I could nail it into each other and make sure it was all solid and looked like one piece when I was done painting it. Now I start messing with the design on the front. I had sketched out a dozen different ways that I wanted the top of this thing to look, but I wanted the front of the bar not only to feel bat-like, but to tie into how I was making the tap handles. So I came up with a vision in my head of how I wanted the tap handles to look, and I knew I was going to put a bat symbol on the front of this, so I needed an opening for that, and that was this initial layout that I did. After I cut these pieces, glued them, and stepped back and looked at it, I decided to add more because it looked too plain, even though I had the basic tap handle shape to tie in. I was keeping all this stuff angular because with this bat theme, that's how I wanted it to look, and it was actually a lot easier than trying to do a bunch of round stuff. This, on the other hand, was not. The main piece on the front of this, the bat symbol, had to be good. Luckily, I took my time on this and I got this thing done the exact way I wanted it on the first attempt. Patience pays off sometimes. And with this being a decorative piece, I busted out the Dremel, smoothed off all the edges and made sure it looked perfect. Because you can't have the bat symbol looking sloppy on your bat bar. When you're doing a project and you're shooting from the hip, you're going to redo stuff. That's just a fact of life. So after the first run on the coffin top setup, I completely redesigned it and started over. I'm actually much happier with the way that it turned out as opposed to how I was starting to do it, because this one's a lot more solid, has more space, and works better for putting a menu up in the back, which you'll see I do later. I also decided to make it a little bit bigger because I wanted to have good airflow going through it. I put in a fan later on to keep the coffin top cool, to cool the beer lines, to prevent foamy pours. This is another part of the project that was very cumbersome, getting the angle set up properly on that top piece. The reason why I'm not just screwing this top piece in later on is because I want this to be removable. So if I ever need access to the lines or to switch out my shanks up top, I can. I got my workout doing test fits on this thing who knows how many times. Right now I was seeing if the process of sliding this thing in the back worked, and also checking my height on the trim that I put on the sides to make sure that when I put the top on, everything would actually line up and it would actually work. I'm also checking the thickness on the top to make sure that when I put the towel on, everything's going to line up and look clean. The pieces of trim that I used for the top were actually perfect for the thickness of the travertine towel that I had, so that they would be down just slightly. And I was lucky because the thickness of the travertine towel, along with this trim and the thin set, made it perfect to towel the top of this thing when I was done. I attached the OSB to the trim out square that I made for the top, and now it's on to set up the rest of the trim, so there's an overhang between the bar top and the box that I actually built to hide the freezer. Started working on a 2-inch trim that hangs down below the lid. This will cover the gap that's created between the actual freezer lid and the top box that I'm creating for the Keezer bar, so that it all looks like one piece. Then back to work on the coffin top. This is the back piece, so it's just thin plywood that I'm just gluing and nailing onto this, since it's all cosmetic. I hit all the edges and all the corners, all the gaps and pinholes with wood filler. After I sand this and paint it, I wanted to make sure that everything trim-wise and decorative-wise looked like one piece. I ended up cutting off edges on the back because after I test fit the lid, I realized when I opened it up, it was going to hit that back corner. This is when I decided to add more to the front. I felt like it was looking a little bit too plain, and I also wanted to mimic the tap handles that I had planned later on, so those two shapes tied this whole thing together. I'm prepping the front board for the coffin top, drilling these holes out so the shank will come through. I lined all the wood that wasn't part of the actual freezer and in the coffin top with this 1-inch insulation foam. It was pretty cheap, really easy to work with because you just cut it and snap it. And I wanted to make sure that I had everything as insulated as possible so that I was getting good pours. Before I made this thing, I researched online, and I found out a lot of people had issues with foamy pours due to the temperature difference between where the kegs are sitting and the coffin top. One of the ways to mitigate that issue in a coffin top is to insulate it as much as you can and to keep a fan circulating the air up so that the temperature between the coffin top and where the kegs are sitting is the same. That's why I used this 1-inch foam insulation everywhere I could. Now I'm routing the electrical wire for the light that's going to light up my menu. I got these cool LED lights that not only dim, but you can change the color of. It's pretty cool for the menu because if I got bored, I could change the color of the light that sit on the menu. I put trim pieces on that removable top portion. I also put trim pieces on the permanent back. Did this to tie the two together so it looks like it's all one piece, and also just to make it a little bit more secure and easier to slide that piece in and out so you're not looking at the seams. I did a quick outline of where my drip tray was going to be because this is going to go all the way through the lid and drain down into a bottle. Then I started drilling out the holes and the openings that are going to run the lines up into my coffin top. I did 2 of these, one so that I could run all the lines up, and I could set a fan up that's going to circle the air up into the coffin top to keep the beer lines and the coffin top the same temperature as the rest of the bar. Drilled my drain line for my drip tray. And I also had to route her out the difference to make sure that this was going to be the proper depth so that it would sit on top of my travertine towel. It wouldn't stick up from there. After that, I just started using the router to smooth off all the edges of the rest of the wood pieces for the trim top. I used the same 45-degree angle router bit on all my trim pieces. I wanted that to tie everything together, keep the angular theme going for the bat bar, and it really did make it so that the whole bar, all the trim pieces, and the front tied together. This piece that goes across the back screws into the frame of the box that I created, and it also screws into the collar that I put on the Keezer bar. This is the piece that actually is going to secure both of those pieces together to make them rigid so the freezer doesn't slide around when you're opening and closing the lid. Next was drilling out holes to use bolts to and then I also drilled out the hole for the drain for the drip tray. I drilled out and then cut out the holes in the top of the freezer lid. This just matches the holes in the cutouts that I put in my bar top so that my beer lines can go through and I can set up my fan for airflow. Doing one of my mini dry setups just to see how everything looks together and make sure I didn't miss something in a measurement and make sure that I'm happy with it before I actually start securing everything together. That's my menu that I'll be using Velcro to attach to the back to label my beers. And I just made that out of a piece of plywood. If you are thinking about building yourself a Keezer bar, I hope that this video has given you the encouragement to do it. This was a really fun project. It took a lot of time, but I wasn't in a rush. I was the client, so I could take as long as I wanted to get it done. And you can kind of do it however you want. If you want to do a basic one that ties into your furniture, you do that. If you want to do a themed one like I did, you could do that. It's not a real expensive project, and it is a lot of fun. And you'll probably get a lot of compliments when people come over because you've got a custom Keezer bar. You can pay a lot of money to buy a pre-made Keezer, but building one yourself the way you want it, customizing it, not only is it less expensive, but it's definitely more personal. Now for the tap handles. I actually ended up doing these 3 times pretty much. I did a first one initially, and then after I had finished it, I didn't like the way it looked. Then I did a set of 3. And as I was finalizing those, I realized that they just didn't match each other. So then I used a technique that I don't know why I didn't start with, because I did it for the legs of a kitchen table that I built. First I made the template. And then I used this first one to mark off the other 2 so that they would match the cuts. After I got these cut as close as I possibly could to match the original one that I used as a template, I clamped them all together and I sanded them to make sure they were the exact same dimensions before I started working on them individually. Then I did some finishing sanding on these. I created a jig to hold these while I routed the edges to round them off. I used a round off bit on the router to make the handles round, and then I used the 45-degree angle again on the top of the taps so that all those angles would tie in with the 45 degrees that I was putting on the trim work on the bar itself. I didn't have any pieces of wood that were the exact thickness that I needed to make sure that when I was drilling the holes for the tap handles to screw onto the taps, the hole was directly in the middle and straight up. So I ended up MacGyvering this jig where I created a stationary drill out of my hand drill so that I could slide these tap handles directly into the bit and make sure that those drilled holes were straight up. The second set that I did that I ended up throwing out, that was the issue, was after I drilled them, I realized the angles on those were not the same, and when you screwed them on, they didn't line up. Initially I hit these all with that same black paint that I used on the rest of the Keezer bar. Later on I actually ended up pulling these things off and spraying them because I didn't like how the brush strokes showed up on these handles. I used a fair amount of glue to connect the bar top to the lid. This is permanent. If I ever have to replace this thinking ahead, I realized that the lid and the bar top to the bar were going to stay, and the collar that I had made. The only thing I was going to replace was going to be the deep freeze. And as long as I got a deep freeze that was close enough in dimensions that I could attach the collar to it, it doesn't matter that the lid and the bar top are permanently connected because I'll never be changing them out. I didn't know I was actually going to need this. I figured that the deep freeze would last as long as the Keezer bar, but because I was not paying attention once to how much it was freezing over, the unit frosted up too much for it to work effectively, and the unit just ran continually until it burnt out the compressor. Now that all painting's done, I went over the entire thing with a satin lacquer, just to tie everything together. Pro tip, if you are buying towel for your top, don't buy travertine. This stuff is really difficult to work with. It is so brittle. Even with this wet saw, you can see pieces just snap. Luckily I had enough extra from doing the kitchen floors before that all these pieces that broke off while I was cutting them, I still had enough to do the bar top. But if you're actually buying a product specifically for this project, I would not recommend travertine. It's just so difficult to work with. Now after I did it, I'm really happy with the way it turned out because it really tied it into my kitchen, and it also has that nice natural stone kind of look to it. But even as small as this bar top was, these minimal amount of cuts I had to make were really, really difficult to keep the pieces from cracking. I had laid out a wiring diagram to start with. The things I'm putting together for this is 2 switches on the side. One will control the light behind the logo on the front of the bar and the light above the menu. And then a second switch will turn on the bat signal that shines on the ceiling. And I'll show you how I built that later. I actually ended up deviating from my original wiring plan to clean it up a little bit inside as I was working with it. And looking back on it, I could have made it even cleaner. But because I had a lot of these extension cords lying around, just old ones, and I got sick of running back and forth to the hardware store for stuff, I just went ahead and did it with what I had on hand. Now, any electrician who watches this and sees the end result is probably going to be gritting their teeth. But as I said, it's all out of sight and it all worked. And I was using extra pieces and extension cords and wires that I had sitting around in my garage, so I didn't have to make more trips to Home Depot to pick up stuff. Wiring up the temperature controller itself is pretty straightforward. They give you a nice diagram. There's an explanation of what all the inputs and outputs do. This one can be used to control hot and cold. So for this application, it makes it even easier because I'm only using it to kick on and off the compressor for chilling. The unit needs constant power to run. And then all I had to do was connect the one relay that trips on and off based on the temperature to the power line for the freezer. This is the LED strip light that I mounted above the menu. The nice thing about this one is there's marked spots on there where you can cut it to length. So after you figure out exactly how long you run, you just cut it with wire cutters. I had a hole in the side of the collar to run wires through. This one is a wire for a PC fan. It's very low voltage, but they're designed to run constantly. And it's not a loud fan, and it really gives you enough airflow to make sure that the cool air is getting pulled up into the collar and keeping those beer lines cold. This is another one of those parts where it worked, but there's probably an easier way to do it. This is me making the bat signal. I put a flashlight in a PVC piece of tubing and then cut out a little bat logo, and then I taped this to the top of the PVC for it to properly project onto the ceiling. And then I just bought a real small low-powered USB light that I wired to put in the back of this thing. Originally, I had a pen light that I had drilled a hole for that sat behind this logo. After I put all this together, the pen light didn't dissipate enough and it wasn't bright enough. I ended up taking this piece off and using the same LED strip light that I used to light up the menu. It actually ended up working out better because it was brighter, and I could also match the color of the menu because the LED strip lights allow you to change the color and the brightness, whereas this pen light did not. I spent a good amount of time actually working on this little bat signal light on the back. There's probably a simpler way to do this, but this was really cheap, and at this point I was coming towards the end of the project, so I figured, what the heck, just keep working on it and get it done. I used chalkboard paint on the piece of wood that I was using for the menu. This worked out good, but with the chalkboard paint and using liquid chalk pens, eventually it started to stain, and the ink would show through whenever I tried to erase it. So I ended up replacing this menu with a piece of plastic that I just painted the back black, so it's glossy and it cleans up completely whenever I wipe off the liquid chalk. Again, I'm using some leftover grout, sand grout that I had from the kitchen project. Mix it up a little bit thinner so it would be easier for me to jam into the cracks, and also because you're not walking around on this like a floor, it's just for decoration. The whole thing is finally coming together. Doing the last bit of cleanup on the top and the sides, wiping everything down and getting it prepped for final assembly. I put this foil tape all over the inside of that insulation. I didn't really need to do this, but I am glad I did because it does make it easier to keep clean and it just makes it look more uniform. After I redid the light with the strip light, the LED came in, the Bat logo lights up a lot brighter. It actually gave the look that I wanted. For the tap handles, I bought these kits that come with a piece that you screw into the tap handle, and then you could screw on the bottom to attach it to the faucet. The tricky part was getting it lined up so that the tap handles faced forward. Now I'm just lining it up so that when I screw them in, they all line up straight. I glued carpet sliders onto the bottom of this. I did 4 originally, and then I had to add a bunch more because once I put all the kegs in there, this thing was really heavy and 4 sliders wasn't cutting it. I cut all my beer lines the same length. The advantage of using those Purelink adjustable flow faucets is that I don't have to deal with adjusting the beer lines based on the carbonation or the style of beer that I'm pouring. I can just adjust the flow rate at the top. I was told that if you just maintain your beer lines and you keep them clean, you never have to replace them, but I didn't want to risk it. And that's another reason why I set this up so that I could take that top off if I had to get access to the shanks to replace these beer lines if I needed to. I labeled all of my beer lines 1, 2, and 3, so it made it easy for me to put kegs in and know exactly which line I was connecting to them for which tap up top. I didn't have to deal with tracing lines later on. And I did some dry fitting here to figure out the exact positioning of all these kegs and the CO2 tank. This is my 3 pressure manifold. I got 3 kegs in here. I wanted versatility on my Keezer bar since I'm building this once. This allows me to set individual pressure for each 3 kegs. So if I'm doing different styles of beer that I want at different carbonation levels, I can adjust it here. This is another CO2 line that I'm running out the side of the bar. I use this for putting CO2 on my kegs if I'm going to have to store them in the fridge for a little while before I actually tap them, and I can use it to force carbonate it if I'm in a hurry. I made my actual menu removable. One, it's a lot easier to pull this out to draw the art on it whenever you're writing down what beer is on tap, and it makes it a lot easier to clean. Plus, I can remove this when I'm cleaning out my taps themselves so it's not splashing beer onto the menu and smearing everything. And this is the way I made that bat signal cast onto the ceiling. Cut out a really small little bat symbol, put on a piece of clear tape, taped it at the end of this tube. And the light that shoots behind this gives just enough of a clear pattern that it looks like the bat signal cast up onto the sky from the movie. I'm using this semi-rigid USB extension thing I found on Amazon. This is what I ran through the hole, but it allowed me to support the light itself just by plugging it in here and aiming it whatever direction I wanted it to hit the ceiling. It would hold in place fine, but it would allow me to adjust it later if I needed to move it. I went ahead and put some chains on the sides just to make sure that when this thing was fully open, the weight wasn't all being held by the hinge. After I put the whole lid together and put that coffin top on, I realized how much weight was actually sitting on that thing whenever it was open, and I just felt a lot better having a second secure method to take the load off of those hinges. A couple things I changed since this initial build. One, when my freezer died and I got the new one, I flipped it so that the front was actually facing the back of this. That allowed me access to the drain port on the freezer so that when I get condensation buildup, instead of me having to use a pump to get it out of the bottom, I could just pump it out through the drain line that's actually built into the freezer. The other thing that I did, I put a false bottom in the bottom of this whole thing to sit the kegs on top of, so that whenever it does start to get a lot of condensation and freeze up, my kegs are sitting above that and not sitting in the water at the bottom of this thing. I have the space to do it, and it makes it a lot easier when this freezes to try and pull kegs in and out, and also to deflow it and drain it. One power cord runs the whole thing. Everything goes through that controller and the electro wiring I put on the inside. As you see, all my lights work. They look a little better in the dark. There it is, the final product. Well, mainly the final product. It's like I said, I did a couple of modifications between this original build and now, but that is it. The controller allows me to adjust the temperature that I want this thing to sit at for serving my beer. And when I want to defrost it, I just turn that off, let everything melt in there, and drain it out the back. If you guys are even contemplating building yourself a Keezer bar, I would say do it. This was a lot of fun to make. Definitely a great way to serve your home brews, and I get a lot of compliments on it when people come over. I hope this video gave you guys some ideas for building a Keezer bar your own, and if you're on the fence about doing it, I hope that the tutorial I gave kind of made it easier and gave you the courage to go ahead and go for it, because it was a lot of fun to do. And as always, keep brewing.